Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Jalen and today I'm sharing the best individual short stories that I read this year. So I've been thinking about content to make as like end of year reflection, and I wanted to talk about individual short stories that I really loved because I often only talk about short story collections during my wrap-ups and I don't really talk about individual stories that really stood out to me within those collections. And so I have a stack of books and I picked one story from those collections that I really encapsulates what I love so much about the short form. As you all know, I love short stories. I actually read a little bit less than I predicted I would this year, and hopefully next year I can pick up some more collections and keep that going. But in the meantime, let's reflect on what I read this year. So the first one I will share is a book that I was super excited to purchase. There's a little bit of a story behind this. So it's called My New Novel by Ottessa Moshfegh, who is my favorite writer. Follow another author, Emma Cline, who I really love, and I love her short stories. I've read her collection last year, so she's not included in this wrap-up, but she started this new imprint with this art gallery, I believe, called Gagosian. I don't know how to pronounce it, but she's starting this new imprint of individual short stories that are published with this really amazing binding. Looks really nice. Hopefully it shows in the camera. And it's also paired with art. So it's in this flap. I won't pull it out because I don't want to damage it at all. I'll just put a picture up of what the art is tied to the story. And so stories by Ottessa Moshfegh. The picture or painting, I believe, is The Down Payment by Issy Wood. I also just love the story. So this was a $30 individual short story that I purchased, which I normally wouldn't do. But I love Ottessa Moshfegh. I love Emma Cline. I wanted to support the new imprint. It's a smaller imprint. I think they only published 2,000 copies of this book. And so I'll link it below if it's still available, if you want to buy one yourself, if you're also a Moshfegh stan like I am. But I think this story is one of her funniest and most critical and incisive stories that she's written to date. This one actually follows a man who is a writer working on a novel, and the story opens on him going to his analyst or therapist and basically talking to them about his struggles trying to write a novel and how the ideas aren't coming to him, how he's previously published a successful novel, and this one he's kind of like writing on the success of that one, but he wants to follow it up with something good. You gradually learn that this writer is not very likable, which is not a shocker for a Moshfegh story, and you also get a quite eccentric therapist, which is another staple example. Dr. Tuttle from My Year of Rest and Relaxation. Similar vibes here, but there's no prescriptions being given, but just poor advice, I would say. Or not poor advice, but maybe a little bit harsh critique of their patient. And so when he starts trying to write his next novel, he enlists the help of a Craigslist stranger who comes to his house, and I won't spoil what happens, but things don't go as well as planned. This one was just a really funny takedown of an adrift, egotistical writer, and it was a really cool way of seeing Ottessa Moshfegh dabble in a little bit of literary criticism through the story. I thought it was a really funny and smart look at this. She has some slight digs at David Foster Wallace at the end of it. The writer, he loves playing back a speech that he gave at a certain graduation ceremony. I forget at what university, but I was doing a little bit more research into that, but it's just really funny overall. I think you'll like it if you love Moshfegh. It's very signature her, but a little bit different and very smart. And I think it's cool that she put this singular story in this form. I think it's really fun. It's a great collector's item for me to have as a Moshfegh stan. So next up, I have a story from this collection called How to Pronounce Knife. This is one that I gave 5 stars. I think every story here is so well crafted. They're all quite brief, but I think this is a master class in how to do short stories, in my opinion. There's so much escalation and suspense that's put in these stories while also looking at Laotian immigrants and navigating being othered in many situations. And so the one story I picked from here is called Slingshot. This one follows an older woman, I believe she's in her 70s, who enters into an entanglement with her neighbor, who I think is in his 30s, so quite an age gap there, but they start talking about love and sex. You learn more about the narrator, who has not been in a relationship since I think her husband died a while back. You see her kind of being a voyeur of the neighbor and how he's, more sexually free as a younger male, and they eventually become sexually involved together. I just thought this one is a really stunning and moving portrait of an older woman seeking and longing for love and what that looks like in a power dynamic between young and old. It was something I've never really seen in a story before, and I thought it was done so well. And I was reading it with the book hotties, and I remember messaging them being like, Slingshot is incredible. Yeah, I think if you are looking for a place to start, I would try that one, but all the stories here are fantastic. And so the next story I have is from a collection called You Will Never Be Forgotten by Mary South. This is a collection that I constantly think about, very much rooted in the internet, are also darkly comedic, but often looking at very grim subject matter amidst technological advances and social media and what it means to be moving amidst the internet culture, I guess. And so this one is called Frequently Asked Questions About Your Craniotomy. And I think if I had to pick out of any of the stories that I read this year, I would say this is the strongest individual story that I read. This one follows a brain surgeon, and the story is told in a frequently asked question format. So you get a question and there's a reflection, and so it opens reading as if you are going to have brain surgery and you're reading this FAQ about what to expect. But what is so brilliant about the story collection is that it gradually focuses on the brain surgeon and kind of becomes more of a reflection on her mind, in her brain, and seeing how being a brain surgeon, using that as a metaphor for trying to understand one's own psyche, desires, depression. And I just loved the flip it does. And it's very gradual. You don't really see it coming too much. And then you realize that the story is something that you didn't really expect it to be going into it. I'm kind of spoiling that for you, but it still will be incredible to read. I think it's just a really interesting and innovative way of telling a story as well through like an FAQ format. It just really blew my mind, and it was sad, and I loved it. Next up, I have Filthy Animals by Brandon Taylor. I talk about him all the time on the channel. I wanted to talk about the title story of this collection called Filthy Animals. And this one, I just remember being so shocked and moved by. It follows a group of younger teenagers and being queer and the violence that ensues amidst internalized homophobia, especially when you're younger in a location. This story is set in rural Alabama, and so it's clearly not as accepted amidst these teens, and seeing them grappling with their desires for each other, particularly in one relationship here. I was just incredibly moved by it, and the scene setting that he does. I feel like he'd be an incredible screenwriter. I feel like every scene that he sets with these characters is so perfectly detailed and nuanced in its depiction of interpersonal relationships and the drama and tension that is internalized often within his stories between these different characters. As a collection as a whole, some of these stories are interconnected and some of them aren't, and this one was not interconnected with the rest, but this one really stood out to me, and I understand why he titled the collection after that story. I think it's a perfect example of his skill as a writer. So definitely check this collection out and that story if that sounds interesting. Next up, I have William Way by Amie Barrodale. This is a collection that I picked up because I was approaching a reading slump. I think this was like a couple months back in like July, I want to say. And I wanted to find something that I knew would be good. And so I looked up Ottessa Moshfegh's favorite writers. And Amie Barrodale, they're, I guess, close friends now. But she said that this is her favorite story collection of all time. And so I instantly went to my library, picked this one up, and I want to share the first story in the collection called William Way. I think it's a really clear representation of Amie Barrodale's style. And I think you can see an influence on Ottessa Moshfegh's writing or just similarities. I'm not sure if she read this story before she wrote some of her own in Homesick for Another World, but I do think that they are two authors that are really in conversation with each other. This whole story collection overall is about miscommunication between people, often looking at quite shitty or just not particularly likable characters, which I love to read about, and that's a signature for Ottessa Moshfegh stories as well. But this one, we focus on one man who's living in a small apartment. He's lonely, and so initially you're introduced to a lonely character who's kind of like, an outlier in society, and he starts getting these calls from a woman who said that she saw or met him at a party, and eventually moves away from being purely by phone, and they meet in real life, and you kind of see their miscommunications and how their relationship kind of changes throughout the course of the story due to the representations to each other, and just seeing this lonely man navigating this kind of odd circumstance with this woman. Overall, if you want a story that is deeply interpersonal, and if you like stories about miscommunication and seeing how people hurt each other and navigate different kind of relationships in their life, I think you'll really like this. If you like a character-focused short story, this is a really good one. Okay, next up, switching gears just a little bit, I have some horror for you. This one is The Strange Things We Become and Other Dark Tales by Eric Larocca. And the story I want to talk about is Bodies Are for Burning. This one, I think, is very representative of Eric LaRocca's style in terms of him really not holding anything back in his fiction, and I really like that. I think he kind of pushes the limit for readers, at least for me. I know there's a lot of, incredibly extreme horror out there. I don't think this would really qualify as extreme horror. I will say that I was disturbed by this story. We basically follow this one woman who is grappling with terrible thoughts about having a desire or feeling impulsive desires to burn things. She is asked to babysit, I think, her niece, if I recall correctly. Doesn't really matter. She's asked to babysit a child. She's kind of grappling with the decision to do that given her compulsions to burn things, and you see her eventually start to watch this child, and you're basically sitting on the edge of your seat waiting to see what she's going to do to this child. And I will say I could not put the story down. All the stories in this collection are similar. I think this one is one of the darker ones in this collection, but they all have a similar sense of stakes and constant escalation for the reader when you're reading it, that you will not put any of these down once you start them. And I think that's a clear indication of a good story collection. And I think horror is a good vehicle for short stories, or vice versa. Short stories are good for horror because I think it's enough to keep you with a sense of dread that a novel, I think it's harder to pull off when you have a big number of pages. I feel like you can kind of lose the suspense and the eeriness. And I think a short story is kind of just, it knocks you out right away. It does what it needs to do, and it leaves you with the fallout. This story collection does that very, very well. Highly recommend this one. If you like anything spooky and if you have the stomach for some dark stuff, I would pick this up for sure. Okay, next up, I have a very smart, very good story collection. The Office of Historical Corrections by Danielle Evans. Solid collection of stories that I read, I think, at the beginning of the year. I see often, like on Twitter and literary circles online, I see that Danielle Evans is considered to be like a master of the short form and contemporary writers, and I can totally see why. And I think the one story that stood out to me the most from this collection that I could tell that she just knows what she's doing is Boys Go to Jupiter. It's the third story in this collection, and I think it does this really interesting, a lot of her stories do this. They're often quite surprising. She'll throw a big twist at you at some point in the story and you're not really expecting it, but she does a really good examination in this collection about race and history, and we can either step away from our past or ways that we cannot, and seeing how her characters grapple with those questions. And aside from just, racial history, also just personal traumas and grief. That's a big centerpiece of the story collection. And so this one follows a young college student who has a picture go up online of her wearing a Confederate flag bikini that her boyfriend basically told her to wear to piss off her stepmom. It goes viral and the student gets canceled. You kind of see this character get canceled online and the ways that she responds to that as a young white college student, and she kind of becomes defensive of herself. She doesn't think that she was trying to wear it to be racist or trying to make a statement about her support of what that represented, but rather she was just kind of doing it, playing along with her boyfriend, and didn't really expect it to go up online after her boyfriend posted online. And so you see her reckoning with the decision to do this and being canceled online and the ways that she deals with it. One poor thing that she does is she slips a postcard, I think, underneath one of her roommate's doors with, I think, the picture on it or something, and the roommate she's not receptive to the apology that she gives, and she basically files a complaint against the student. You also see her putting the picture up on her window facing out of the dorm so everyone sees it, and so she's trying to defend herself, saying that she's not racist. The cringiness that ensues from that, basically. What I think from there, brilliant premise, but also the story kind of opens up at a certain point in which you see into the past of this character. And I don't want to spoil any of that part, but you learn a little bit more about this character, how the past plays with the present and the impact of all of these things on her, given some experiences that she had as a younger teenager. I'll just leave it there, but I will tell you, I was shocked by the story at the twist that happened. It's just a really good, unputdownable look at cancel culture and racism in a very tight story. And I don't think you can put this down when you started. It's so good. And yeah, highly recommend this story and this collection. Both incredible. I have another writer who, this is my favorite short story writer right now. It is Laura Vandenberg and her collection, The Isle of Youth. This is an older collection of hers. She has a newer one called I Hold a Wolf by the Ears. That is my favorite short story collection of all time. And I wanted to pick up some more backlist of hers. And every single time you pick up a Laura Vandenberg story, you know it's going to be exquisite. 5 stars. I've never been disappointed by a story of hers. I'm always surprised. I can never put them down. I always think about them for a long time after I finish them. Just everything that you want out of a story collection. I feel like Danielle Evans and Laura Vandenberg are very similar in the ways that they escalate in their stories. They often have similar themes in terms of often women grappling with grief or trauma or some kind of reflection on their past and how it's playing with the present. And I think one story that does that very, very well here is, I think it's the second story. Yeah, it's called, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right. I think it's Opa-Locka. This is a look at 2 sisters. I do tend to find I like stories about sisters and siblings relationships. One of my favorite books from last year was Sisters by Daisy Johnson, and I just like that in a novel or story. This one follows 2 sisters who open their own kind of private firm for private investigations, and so it opens on them on top of a roof on one of their jobs or missions. You learn more about these sisters and their past and how they decide to take 2 different paths. One of them decides to no longer operate as a PI, and one continues to do that. And so you see the weight of that decision for each sister and how they kind of split in that divide. But more so what this book or what this story looks at is the ways in which their estranged father, general parent relationships are quite fraught, and how that plays into the present in the action that ensues in the story. I will say something I was not expecting happens in the story, and I was shocked by it. That's a common thing in her stories particularly. I don't want to spoil what happens, but she's not afraid to do damage to people in her stories. So I like the feeling of when you're starting a short story, not knowing where it's going, never knowing what you're going to get into, just knowing that you're in the hands of a good writer and that she's going to take you places that you're not really expecting, will make you uncomfortable, and will also just give you exquisite prose, sentences, and reflections and insights on humanity that I just don't understand how she does it. So highly recommend her generally, but that story I think is a really good representative of her style. Alrighty, I have one more story for you, and I mean, kind of just a general book recommendation. It is A Swim in a Pond in the Rain by George Saunders, and the story in particular in here that I want to talk about is Master and Man by Leo Tolstoy. So this is a book that is completely, I want to say, outside of my comfort zone, probably one of the most unique books that I read this year. It is essentially, a short story collection, but more so, this is a book of literary criticism from George Saunders, who gives you a masterclass in Russian literature. So George Saunders gives you, I think it's 7 stories in this collection, and with each story, he gives you some form of lesson or reflections, basically an essay on what he thinks about the story, why he thinks that they work so well, gives tips for readers and writers alike to, one, appreciate short stories, or if you're writing them yourself, trying to learn from the prose that he thinks are Russian writers, how to emulate that yourself in your writing. Really has you reflect on what you're thinking throughout these stories. So namely in the first story, he gives you 1 page at a time, and then he dips in and makes you, he asks questions of you. What are you thinking? Where do you think the story is going? Why is he putting this character here now? Do you agree with having a character enter here? Do you want more reflection from this character? Basically giving you a brainstorming session for yourself. But middle of this book is a story called Master and Man, which I thought was incredible. It was a long story. I think it's 50 pages, I want to say. Yeah, 50 pages. Before reading this book, I've never really read the Russians at all. And I think I can kind of get a sense from this story in particular what is so appealing about Russian literature, and that's why next year I want to read more of it. I want to pick up some more Anton Chekhov stories, Leo Tolstoy stories, and I also want to read The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. I really want to read that book, get more into Russian lit. I really liked what I read here. This is a big, long story that's basically an adventure tale. We follow a landowner and his peasant who are on a journey on a horse to go purchase new property. Environmental disaster strikes and how that causes them to be stranded in a blizzard and what ensues from there. And you kind of see the power imbalance between the landowner, so the rich and poor here, and the dynamics between these characters. And I just loved, reading the story in full, but then afterward, really seeing how, pull up an example for you, how George Saunders really reflects on every single event in action in the story. So he goes all out in this book. So he gives you diagrams of the course of events in the story, and he reflects on causation, namely in the story, and how things lead to another, and just seeing how a story is told from beginning to end and what makes it effective versus what does not make an effective story. And I think George Saunders is one, super persuasive, but really helped inform my own reading of the story, because I feel like if I had just read it, it's a good story in itself, but it was really blown out by George Saunders' affection and appreciation for the actual craft here, which I think is so necessary to really getting the most out of short stories, is really considering, why is a story being told in this form? What is it doing to keep the reader engaged? And, given such a minimal page count, how is it lending itself to characterization with not having a full novel to explore a character's mind? Saunders really explores that here and helped me understand why I love short stories so much and informed all of my reading this year. So this is a big recommendation for me. I want to revisit this endlessly throughout my life. I marked this one up, and I learned so much. So that's probably my biggest recommendation for you, is to read this book. And the one story I loved was Master and Man by Leo Tolstoy. So that about does it. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you find a new collection you want to read if you try these individual stories, or if I just sold you on the collection. I hope you like what you find. If you have any individual stories that you love, please recommend them below. Next year, I want to not be afraid to just read individual stories on a whim and maybe include them in my wrap-ups, because I feel like it's really fun to further reflect on a short story and not just kind of let it sweep over you in a full collection and kind of get the gist of them all. I think it's really fun to examine short stories themselves, and I think that's one thing I want to do next year, is read individuals. And so if you have those or just collections that you think I would like, definitely drop them below. I will catch you in the next one. Bye.